Hi, everyone. We're right at noon, so I'm going to kick things off. I'm Stephanie Dorsum. I saw a lot of familiar names on the RSVP list, so glad that you could join us for today. I am in the marketing department at Husch Blackwell. I've been here about 18 years at this point, so I know a lot of you that have joined us. Part of my job is overseeing the alumni program for the firm, so I was really excited that Erik Dullea said that he would give our final Alumni Academy webinar today focused on cyber incident response reporting. So welcome. Just a few quick housekeeping items for the program. We have a lot of things in the audience council for you to explore. So there's, I think, presentation materials, a link to the alumni LinkedIn group that I hope that you'll join, request to join, and then other materials like our microsite. We also will be taking questions throughout the program today in the chat. If we don't get to them at the end of the program, Erik will follow up with an email and answer your questions. We do have CLE hours for this program. You can report by clicking on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. There's an attendance certificate there with course numbers. And then after the program, we'll send out a recording in case you missed any section or want to pass it along to your colleagues. We do ask for your feedback, and I also am looking for any updates that you have with your career or personal life, or if you'd like to be featured in one of our upcoming newsletters, I'd love to do an alumni spotlight. So without further ado, I am so excited to introduce Erik Dullea to the group. He is the head of Husch Blackwell's cybersecurity practice. He comes to us, he was with the firm previously, but then he left the firm and was deputy chief of cybersecurity practice group for the National Security Agency. And then he came back to the firm and is heading up our cybersecurity group. So we're really lucky to have him. The team is growing. We have a 9 attorneys in our Denver office who work on cybersecurity and data privacy matters, and we are expanding. So he also has a prominent role in building the firm's data privacy and AI teams. As you know, that's a really hot topic these days. So without further ado, I will mention a couple of fun facts about Erik that he shared with us before the program. He has a very interesting background. He flew in the Navy. He flew planes in the Navy, and then he was a commercial pilot for United Airlines. And after 9/11 hit, he decided that he needed to take a kind of a different career path. And he ended up starting law school at the age of 36. So he had kind of a different trajectory on getting into private practice. He also likes kayak fishing, which I think is very interesting. And he will fish bass, trout, and walleye. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Erik.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Glad to join you today. What I thought I would do with this discussion is keep it very strategic in the focus and forward-looking on the planning side of how you can advise your organizations when it comes to cybersecurity topics. And I know all of you are well-versed in navigating the legal nuances of competing jurisdictions. We have that here with cybersecurity, just as you do with other legal topics, where there's going to be international compliance concerns, federal laws, federal regulations that apply, state laws. In some cases, there will be state regulations. But for cybersecurity, what tends to, I think, happen is that we start to blend or have some overlap because of similarity between data privacy topics and cybersecurity. So to address that and kind of help put you in a spot where you can tease out those differences and think about the two topics, I wanted to do a basic on privacy to somewhat level set us on where the law stands there. And then we'll dig deeper into incident response planning and how the two of those topics interrelate. So that's sort of how I've laid this out. And on this slide, hopefully you can see the Venn diagram, which I was very proud to find from the National Institute of Standards and Technology published this diagram. And it lays out the risks for cybersecurity and privacy and shows that there's some overlap between the two. What I have on the boxes on the left-hand side and the right-hand side are those concepts and principles that go into the structure or the frameworks that you look at for cybersecurity and contrast that with what we think about with privacy. At a very high level, for me, cybersecurity, we're focused on limiting access to authorized users so that we can protect networks, the devices on the network, and the data that is in those devices. So what we're really looking to do there is make sure that authorized people can get in, use the data and the information appropriately, but limit or prevent the interlopers from getting into that access. Privacy is more focused on how the data is being used by authorized individuals, and also potentially how could it be used by unauthorized individuals. So the other piece of it as well, cybersecurity is in a sense the foundational element that allows privacy programs to exist and to operate. They're both vitally important, but you can have security but not be protecting privacy. It is much more difficult to be protecting privacy without having a security program in place. So here's our first polling question. For the folks that are able to respond, can you let me know if you already know if you are a member of your organization's cybersecurity incident response team, or if you're a backup to a primary member? So go ahead and I've got about 30% of the attendees that have made a choice on that. So thank you as you're participating. We'll give it a couple more seconds before we move on. Kind of at about the halfway mark. %75%. All right, it looks like we've kind of plateaued at about 76%. So let me go ahead and move to the next one. We'll see what we've got for results. So about 50-50. So that's great. Good to know on that, because we'll talk about some of those aspects of who should be in the teams or what kind of groups and stakeholders should be involved. And it really leads to my next slide here. If you have been involved with an incident response team, you're going to be probably faced with these questions of what personal information are we protecting? Has it been exposed or has it been leaked? And what do we need to do in response? So on this slide, I have the bare bones basic aspect of personal information. Some of your older state laws that looked at breach disclosure requirements are focused on these. It's looking at a combination of having an individual's name paired up with a social security number, a driver's license number, credit card information. As the laws have advanced, we've brought in health information, insurance information, and a couple other topics. But it generally is a relatively uniform set of variables that get looked at from a cybersecurity component of breach disclosure notification laws. And we're going to contrast that with a broader definition of personal info, sometimes private information, depending on the jurisdiction and the state that you're operating under. And this list here, I would call to your attention more so from the standpoint of, is your company involved in the business of collecting consumer data? Because if you have a marketing team or a business line that is gathering information about consumers and customers at the individual level, this is sort of the universe of variables or types of information that would be considered personal information. And this is on the privacy side, what a lot of the state laws, California being in a sense the most renowned within the United States, General Data Protection Requirement, GDPR, being the more renowned and baseline or trend-setting law internationally, that looks at what steps are being done to ensure that this type of information that you see on your screen is being processed and handled the way that the organization says that it's going to do. So what is processing? All of the activities up here are generally involved in what is defined as processing of data or personal information. And it goes through the life cycle of obtaining the data, generally thought of collecting, and then how you organize it, how you structure it, how you sort, filter it, how you're going to store it. Do you modify it? How can your employees pull up that data? How can they put it to use in your business line? Are you disclosing it either publicly, or are you in a business model where you are a data broker and you are selling information? And then as the data becomes stale, obsolete, less usable, how are you destroying or deleting the data? From my vantage point, at each of those activity levels, the question becomes, do we have controls in place to make sure that the data is secure at each one of those types of processing activities? Because every time the data is being accessed, there is the potential for a security concern. In order to do that, you really need to start evaluating the risks that go with possessing data about other people. Granted, you need it in order for your business to operate and to function, but performing risk assessments on the types of data that you are collecting is really important. And there's a twofold benefit for that, because as you start to look at these questions, not only do they address or solve some of the regulatory requirements to perform data privacy impact assessments, they also allow you as an organization, or for you as in-house counsel or as outside law firms, to provide advice to the decision makers and corporate leaders on where they should prioritize their security efforts. Lots of times you're going to hear and lament that IT departments, CISOs, especially if they're new in the role, will wind up being very technically focused and have a lot of technical data or financial costs that go into adding a program or a control onto a system, but are not laying out the business case for why the senior management or the boards of directors should authorize spending in order to implement a new control. There are a lot of cool toys that vendors will push out there that say this is necessary, but it really does need to make sense and be prioritized within the risk structure that the organization looks at. This graphic really just shows the same concept in a different way. There's that life cycle of obtaining data, holding on to it, and then destroying it, disposing of it properly. And that's going to be true not only for electronic data, but for paper data and other sorts of information you have about consumers. And then having a security incident and response plan that is going to be applicable and have steps and controls in place at each level of that activity. Why do you want to do this? Well, a couple reasons. First off, it's good for your company's reputation and in your business interest to be able to assure your consumers, your customers, that you are safeguarding their data. That is something that is of growing importance to consumers in the marketplace. And you actually can place yourself at a competitive advantage compared to other businesses if you are able to demonstrate and be seen as a reliable steward that protects that information. But there's also the sticks that go along with that carrot of legal, statutory, regulatory compliance obligations or industry standards that you need to follow. So out of the examples that I put up here, I did tag two of them that I wanted to mention because they've come up a lot in the last year. State privacy laws that generally have those data breach disclosure notifications and contractual obligations. And the reason that I see these as linked, and I wanted to pause here and detour for a minute, is the interplay between the two here is important, but sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense. The states are going to have a requirement that if your company experiences a data breach, you must notify consumers within a certain amount of time. Depending on the number of individuals affected, you are going to have to notify an attorney general for that jurisdiction as it's applicable. And if you are licensed in a particular state to perform your business activity, you may have a requirement to notify the licensing regulator of the event as well. What we saw for the last I'd say 15 months, and certainly in the 100 days or so since I've been back with the firm, are the MOVEit vulnerability and the Clop ransomware gang that exposed that has created a significant disruption for the business economy, because that MOVEit program is a file transfer software that was used by a large number of businesses in multiple industry sectors. And in certain instances, vendors or suppliers and subcontractors down your supply chain were affected, and your data was exposed not by your direct prime contractor, but 2 or 3 rungs down the hierarchy. And the questions that were coming in are, we didn't have a breach, but our data, either involving our employees or involving customers, was exposed by this company that we never heard of, that our business partner hired to do the file transfer work. The state laws generally do not care. They're agnostic on the aspect of who had the breach. They focus on, are you the owner of the data? If you're the owner of the data, then there is an obligation to notify the affected individuals. If you are licensed to process the data, to perform those services on behalf of the data owner, the laws generally say you need to notify the data owner immediately. But you don't get to contract yourself out of an obligation to make those disclosures. What your contracts often can do, and this is part of the legal analysis as your marketing or your purchasing and your acquisitions folks are doing this, they can put that burden on the subcontractor to perform those tasks and to demonstrate to you that they were followed. Advice that I've given to some clients recently, especially if you have a small number of individuals that are affected or they are current employees that are affected, is to send a notification to the affected employees that this event occurred. It wasn't on our system, but it was on one of our vendors. They should be receiving a letter from that vendor that provides identity monitoring services and other resources to them. And then I even encourage them to put the caveat at the bottom: if you don't receive that letter within the next 30 days, contact so-and-so in the legal department so that we can find out where the hangup is. Because that way you are demonstrating your due diligence, that you are taking the obligations to notify affected individuals seriously. The burden is on the company that agreed to take that risk for you, but you're able to sort of verify that they've done their work and that the notifications have gotten out that the law requires for you, as well as for them as the business unit that suffered the breach. The state laws are going to continue to move and evolve. You know, if most of you, as Husch Blackwell alumni, we have this interactive map up on bitebacklaw.com, which is the law that Dave Sauce, my partner and chair of the data privacy side of our practice, spends a significant amount of time keeping current. This looks and is updated as each state goes through legislative activity. There's a second map that will look at states that have been rolling out biometric laws as well. So those resources are available for you to subscribe to and get your timely updates for the jurisdictions that you're interested in. And then lastly, this page is an IAPP resource. It's at the international front, which is not something I spend a lot of my time on, but we are seeing comprehensive laws in other countries be established that look at how the data for their residents are going to be affected and controlled. Sometimes, as you notice looking at the map, and you see People's Republic of China is one of the countries that has imposed that, as well as Brazil. There are ulterior motives, in my opinion, coming out of the national security space for why those countries put those laws in place. They are not necessarily to protect the rights of their citizens, but more to maintain economic advantage or a competitive advantage, or to quell domestic dissent. So a lot of things that are going on with those, but if you have a business that's working in the international space, you do need to be mindful of them. GDPR in the European Union, a very different approach than the other two countries that I just mentioned as examples. That law is much more focused on protecting the rights and of EU residents. However, it's enforced at the member nation level. So you can see differences in how Ireland handles it, how the UK handles it, and how mainland European countries handle it. So on the privacy side, there's a lot going on, and it does tie into cybersecurity, which is where we're going to go next. There's certainly the temptation to feel that overwhelmed or to be uncertain on where to start. But generally what we have recommended is to keep in mind that being good at something today is better than trying to be perfect at it tomorrow. So having something in place is much better than waiting until you get to a perfect solution. No solution is going to be applicable or perfect for all situations. So there's generally always going to be a small amount of ambiguity and risk. Part of that is going to be because the rules continue to change. And as you work a program through a large organization, it might take you 90 days to get there. Something may change in the meantime. New York's Department of Financial Services had rolled out cybersecurity guidelines for the entities they regulate in, I believe, 2022, and they just updated it again on November 1st of this year. So there's changes there, some of them which were quite surprising and noteworthy to me, at least, because in the idea of a cybersecurity incident and the requirement to report, NYDFS now wants to know about attempted unauthorized access to your network, even if unsuccessful, if there is the belief that it was done with malicious intent. So they're not necessarily looking for the instance of, I left my laptop in my Uber drive, going from the hotel to the airport, but I got it back. But more of, we saw attempts to penetrate our network, our controls repelled the effort, but it was a sophisticated attempt. Those are some of the data collection efforts that NYDFS is expecting its covered entities to share with them. So, incident response in and of itself. Where do we go with it? I think my next polling question is coming up. Again, to have a sense beyond what I saw on the attendee list, how many of you are familiar with knowing if your organization is, considered to be part of our critical infrastructure sectors? If you're not sure, perfectly fine, because it's somewhat of a self-selecting process. There are 17 sectors now. It used to be 16. They just added space into the list of the sectors. And the reason I bring this up is that companies that are part of a critical infrastructure have the benefit or the opportunity to ask for support or resources from the sector risk management agency that is associated with that sector. And that comes out of Presidential Policy Directive 21, PPD 21, first signed in 2013. It's when I left the agency this summer, it was going through rewrite. So I expect that we will see another iteration of that declaration come out under the Biden administration. And the assessment and the belief is it's going to put a greater role and emphasis on the work that CISA is doing. CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's a component of the Department of Homeland Security. And they already had cross-sector responsibilities, but I think you're going to see CISA being directed to take more of a role for business entities that may not fall into a critical infrastructure sector, to make sure that we're not leaving part of the American economy or marketplace, on the curb without resources to help defend itself. All righty, so I've got some answers here. 1/3 for yes, 2/3 for no. Perfectly fine, because on to the next one was what I was just talking about with the sector risk management agencies. For the 1/3 that are there, do you know which agency is paired up with you? And the reason that I thought this was at least worth asking is the Department of, Environmental Department. Let me scroll down and make sure I've got my exact verbiage, because I suddenly got hung up on EPA. I knew I had it wrong. The Environmental Protection Agency is the agency that is assigned to support the water and wastewater systems within the U.S. So that would be your private sector, but also your state or your municipal sectors that are moving, making sure we have water coming out of the tap, but also taking care of the sewage systems, which is a much bigger concern in large metropolitan areas. But in the news this morning, there was a report that a municipal water system just outside of Pittsburgh was victimized by a cyber attack that has been attributed to proxies of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And in contrast to the previous two stories where I saw over the last 4 years, where I had seen attempts to penetrate a water system where they were unsuccessful, this attack did have some effects. According to the news, the water system and the supplier is operating its pumps in somewhat of a degraded or a manual mode at the moment as they continue to bring things back online. The reason I thought that was interesting, especially, was that the EPA in 2022, I think early last year, had rolled out proposed cybersecurity guidelines that it wanted to impose or lay out for wastewater and water systems. Several state attorney generals challenged whether the EPA had the authority to impose those requirements, and EPA recently withdrew those proposed regulations. So we've seen that an effort for an agency that is assigned to be a resource and support mechanism for a particular sector gets pushed back at the state level for exceeding its authority. But the problem is not going to go away. And we are going to see more attempts to disrupt or interfere with critical infrastructure going forward. Okay, great. Everybody, in a sense, has some of the familiarity with those sectors. And I will confess, having been, my time in the agency, the Department of Defense, unsurprisingly, is the agency that is responsible for the defense industrial base. And to give it a sense of the numbers of companies involved, there are anywhere between 250,000 and 400,000 U.S. companies, because they may be subcontractors or suppliers or vendors to other companies and defense contractors that would be considered part of the defense industrial base and are eligible to get some of the resources that the DoD provides to defense contractors in the cybersecurity arena. All righty, so I'm going to go through some of the sticks again when it comes to incident response, because I found two cases that were, one of them relatively brand new and one of them that occurred 2 years ago, sort of during the heyday of COVID, that you all may remember, that give us some examples on why incident response plans and information security programs are important. The most recent example is at the federal level. If you're familiar with SolarWinds and the attack that company experienced through what's been attributed to Russian intelligence services, they were penetrated, and the threat actors utilized a malware bug that they inserted into patches that SolarWinds was sending out to its customers. So they, in a sense, hid themselves within what normally would be considered legitimate activity from the software manufacturer and developer going out to its customers that allowed the Russian SVR to gain access to the networks in the private sector and the government sector across a wide range of networks. That occurred in, if I remember right, December 2019, and we saw the repercussions of that come to play in 2020 when it became public. Only last month, the SEC has decided to take enforcement action against not only SolarWinds as the corporate entity, but named the current Chief Information Security Officer as one of the defendants as well for a civil enforcement action. What I find interesting about the timing of that investigation is the event occurred when there was a different CEO. A new CEO is in charge of the company ever since it was disclosed. And the gentleman that is the CISO that is named in the enforcement action was not in that role at the time the incident occurred. However, the SEC is taking statements that were made by the company and by this new CISO, Mr. Brown, and are attributing them as material misstatements that misled investors. So everything is at the allegation phase for that case. So that's about as much as I want to spend time on for it. But we have not just federal enforcement risk when it comes to cybersecurity actions. We have activities by state attorneys generals as well. And these will be the two cases we'll talk about here for the next slide or two. Everybody remembers when Zoom became a popular platform for us to use at home and for our kids to use at school and for town hall meetings and other events. And then the next one was Mediata, which is a healthcare company that also has just recently settled enforcement actions with 37 state AGs. So what do we have for these two cases? Zoom, it was an investigation and an enforcement action brought by the New York Attorney General. And I misspoke on the previous slide, 33 attorneys general led by Indiana that launched an investigation and enforcement action against Mediata. New York did not participate in that one. So you do have two different groups of enforcement or prosecutors involved in these. Both cases have resulted in consent decrees and settlement agreements for each of the two companies. Both of the cases began with federal government investigations at the outset, and then the state attorneys generals picked up the ball and ran with it. Civil penalties, Zoom did not receive a civil penalty when it settled with New York. In Mediata, it agreed to a $1.14 million settlement with all 33 attorneys generals that the AGs have the discretion to divide up accordingly. Class action lawsuits, a very different split in the numbers. $85 million class action settlement that Zoom reached back in I believe it was in 2021. And Mediata last year settled a $1.13 million class action suit. So those activities took place. And then with the state AG actions, the consent decrees that both judges approved required the two companies to implement written information security programs, or ISPs. And what was common for those ISPs were a couple of things. First off, both of them required the companies to take steps to protect the confidentiality, security, and integrity of the data that they possess. So if you think back to that Venn diagram slide that I had at the beginning, on the left-hand side, those are the first three principles of a framework for cybersecurity. We've added authentication and non-repudiation into that mix in recent years, but what was called, in a sense, the CIA triad of confidentiality, security or excessive availability, and integrity of data have always been there. Both companies were required to implement or put in place administrative, technical, and physical safeguards that are commensurate with the sensitivity of the data they were possessing. If you think about those buzzwords, you may have heard them before. Administrative, technical, physical safeguards, that is language that's in HIPAA. It's also in the New York State SHIELD Act, which had been enacted and signed just after the Zoom settlement took place. And for Mediata, the judge also required that as a healthcare company holding on to protected health information, they would need to be getting risk assessments by third parties each and every year. The agreements both required training requirements for their employees that went beyond what the laws or the regulations required. They were also required to name a CISO. So they needed to have a person that was designated and accountable for maintaining this program and protecting data. One of the topics that's getting a lot of discussion within the IT department industry space right now is after the SEC has launched this complaint against SolarWinds, who would want to be a CISO? Or are companies going to need to revisit whether CISOs are going to be covered under D&O insurance policies? Are there other compensation mechanisms or immunity protections that are going to need to be put in place for that job, which sometimes has been called the Chief Information Scapegoat Officer? And then what we get into for the incident response, the other things that the consent decrees required were incident escalation and reporting procedures. So there were a couple of technical controls that were specific to the nature of their two business units, but let's talk about incident escalation and reporting. This is where we get into that idea of preparing for and practicing your incident response plan. The goal of the CISO typically, and I've gotten this from friends of mine that are industry consultants or have been CISOs in the past, is to have a reliable handoff for what is determined to be or looks like a major incident, as opposed to run-of-the-mill glitches and events within an IT network that can be handled by the help desk. So it's a process to get what looks to be a big problem moved up to more informed strategic decision makers, rather than having it handled with frontline folks that are focused on day-to-day, keeping the network running, keeping the lights on. As we look at the phases of incident response, you're going to see a variety of frameworks out there. In the bottom of this slide, I threw 3 examples on there where you can look to choose models if you don't have one in place. I've seen anywhere between 4 and 8 phases that go into the milestones or the big muscle movements of an incident response plan. I'm a little partial to the 4-phase model, more so because NIST uses that one. And for me, it's sort of easier to clump those topics or activities into bigger groups rather than getting too granular when each and every incident or disruption is going to be different. So first off, not only do you need to think about what you're going to have in the plan, you need to decide who's going to be on that team. And that was partly why I asked at the beginning, how many of you are involved in it? An incident response team should be activated to come in and respond to disruptions or events that can have a significant effect on business operations. So the most common one that we've seen in the last year or two had been ransomware attacks, because typically a system will be locked out, nobody can work, and then the question is, how are we going to get people back to work? But as our criminal motivated groups are not only organized but innovative, and they continue to adjust their practices by which they look to penetrate networks and then extract leverage to get compensation, they continue to change their approach. We're going to see shifts and evolutions in the attacks that are taking place and how companies can respond to them. I put up here a line that I took from one of my bosses while I was in the military. Adrenaline is great, but you can't surge trust in a crisis. I can always surge more people. I can generally get more money to work on a response, but building the trust of the other business unit stakeholders or the outside resources that I'm going to work with, or talking to a government regulator or to a government support team, if it is CISA or if it's the NSA or somebody else that's available to help a company that's been victimized, those relationships and those levels of trust take time to build. You can't just necessarily do it during the crisis. So that's one of the reasons you want to select and build your incident response team during normal operations, vet and choose some of those external resources that you would go to ahead of time so that you're not calling them for the very first time when the crisis has erupted. Your incident response team, they're going to be the help to steer the communications plan, not only for internal stakeholders and members of your organization, but external stakeholders as well. And they're going to make some of those big decisions or make recommendations to the CEO or perhaps the board on what to do with a material event. Some of the questions are going to be, can you operate in a degraded mode for that day? Do you need to be closing down? If we are closing down and not operating, are we going to keep the workforce on property, or are we going to be sending them home? When do you want to be talking to law enforcement and to your regulators? If you receive a ransom demand, there are going to need to be discussions on what do we do in response. And now with the SEC's new disclosure requirements, and we'll get to that more here in a moment, if you're a publicly traded company, is it a material cybersecurity event that we're going to need to disclose, or is it not a material cybersecurity event? If it's not material, you probably want to be building a record of the facts and the conclusions that led you to that decision so that you can show it to regulators after the fact and demonstrate that you went through your process. So, incident response cycle, this is the model that NIST lays out and that I like, not only in concept but pictorially, because it shows that it's an ongoing process. There's always going to be planning and preparation. We're going to be detecting and analyzing and looking for threats If we find one, then we're going to be into a small subloop of looking to contain, eradicate, recover, and then also continue to detect and analyze whether those efforts to contain and eradicate were successful. And then we're going to get into the post-incident analysis, take the lessons learned, put them back into our planning and preparation for the next event. Because unfortunately, there are going to be either repeat attacks, novel changes by the adversary to come in and look to extort or harm our interest further, and we want to learn from what we did in the past. So on the planning and prevention side of this, hopefully the slide speaks for itself. It can be a pain and a challenge to get senior business leaders to stop their important day-to-day activities and come and talk about this. And it's also, from a scheduling standpoint, difficult to get a large number of senior leaders, into a room at the same time. So my thought is, and one of the recommendations I've seen some companies do is for their security teams and their risk or their legal departments is try to do it as a lunch and learn. Make it, if you bribe them with food, hopefully they will come. But have short sessions and have very small, discrete topics that can be, bantied about for practice and familiarity in the course of an hour, and then let everybody get back to their day-to-day jobs. To give you one example of this, I ran a tabletop exercise for a client in July, and we walked through a simulated ransomware attack on their company. And we were fortunate this was a client that had the ability to get most of its senior leadership into one conference room. And we sat down and for 90 minutes talked through the scenario with everybody sitting at the table. In October, they experienced a real event. The facts were completely different than what we had practiced. Nothing was the same with the incident. But the feedback after the event was done from the CEO, from the CISO, and from the communications folks was, having done the process before, it helped them figure out how to navigate their way through it for a real event. So you set sort of your expectations low when it comes to running an exercise, because those may not be something that will be directly the same or identical to what you might face in real life. But the habit of getting your stakeholders involved and interacting with each other, taking the inputs from various business units and stakeholders, internal to the company and external to the company, will pay dividends as you try to do this for real when the stress level is much higher and when the stakes are higher. The other one that I have up here, another example, kind of midway down that slide, for geopolitical tensions. I thought this was interesting as well. And this is where legal departments may also be able to think a little bit more holistically. Rachel Wilson is the former director of cybersecurity at the NSA, but she is now the chief of IT security for Morgan Stanley, a wealth management company. She was the keynote speaker at a conference I was at in late September. And there were a couple of points that were interesting that she went through. Obviously, she's a good public speaker. But what I thought was a good example when it came to the geopolitical tensions was during February of 2022, Morgan Stanley and other financial institutions that she interacted with were seeing a significant spike in online account creations that were fraudulent in nature. And as the number of fraudulent applications were increasing, what their companies were doing in response were reducing the pipeline to create accounts through an online process. What Rachel commented about afterwards, 90 days later, as they were doing their analysis, they realized that a lot of that activity was being done by proxies in Russia that were trying to flood the system, in Rachel's opinion, to prevent Ukrainian citizens from moving money out of the country before they tried to evacuate. So it became, in a sense, a denial of service attack in the furtherance of a geopolitical activity right on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So again, it's not something that your IT folks are going to be thinking about. Your business leaders may not be thinking about, but there can be an interplay in the level of risk that a company faces based on where it stands in relation to geopolitical events around the world. So, next slide, what I want to talk about here. When it comes to the analysis and containment, I like these 4 questions, and I will confess I got them from a podcast that I was listening to earlier this year by some of the threat analysts at Palo Alto Networks, and it's the sniping methodology. In the event of you are going through a live incident and you are responding to it, having the team focus on these types of these 4 questions and revisiting them is a methodology by which to navigate your way out of the problem. Because really the first concern should be for all stakeholders, is the intruder still in our network? Is the malware still on our system? And can we eradicate it? I did a tabletop event with ISSA Denver, which is the Information Security Systems Analysis Group. And the system ran through a scenario for a brick and mortar retail store with an online presence. And the scenario led to them to bring their system back online before they had guaranteed they had eradicated the problem. And as they brought their backups back online to resume operations, the backups became infected by the malware. So granted, it's a scenario, it's designed to teach a lesson, but thinking about verifying to the extent that you can that you have eradicated the threat before you are resuming operations can prevent you from starting over and delaying or exacerbating the problem. Next question is, and because questions 2 and 3 are going to drive probably for your senior leaders and your board, is this a material event? What type of data was taken? Where did they go on our network? And then how did they get in? That's the question that generally leads to the most discussion right off the bat. But I think of it sort of like spilled milk on the floor. It's already spilled. I don't care how it tipped over. I have to clean it up and get, and then I can think about changing my, the cause of the problem afterwards. So one more poll question allows me to wet my vocal cords for a second. Folks, if you wouldn't mind answering, are you doing business with publicly traded companies that are regulated by the SEC? I realize many of you may not be publicly traded. For those of you that are, the answer is probably yes. But if if you have business partners that are publicly traded, this is where I was interested in knowing. All right, good response rate. Thank you everybody for clicking buttons. I appreciate it. I'm gonna have one more poll question after this one, but we'll take a look at the results so far. Yep, not surprisingly, a vast majority of you are interacting with publicly traded companies. The reason I approached it from that angle, those SEC disclosure rules that went into place and are effective for annual reports starting in roughly 2 weeks, December 15th, are going to require publicly traded companies to disclose their risk assessment processes, the outside resources and parties that they use to make those assessments, and to, in a limited fashion, disclose areas of risk that the companies have identified. I expect that what that is going to do is lead to more due diligence or questionnaires for the vendors that those companies hire, and ask about how those companies are going to protect the information that they receive from the publicly traded entity. And then, oh, Jeb, I just saw your question, Jeb. Let me take a look at this. It broke my train of thought. But if your company has a disruption, if you have an incident that you're working through, you probably should expect that your business partners and customers that are publicly traded companies are going to be more aggressive or assertive in asking for information from you. And the reason being, they have a deadline based on being notified of a cybersecurity event that they need to, if they determine it's material, they need to be notifying the SEC within 4 business days. So, and that can that can include information that they are made aware of that is publicly available, or it can be through their supply chain. So if you're supplying a company and you have an event, they may need to know more about it so that they can worry about the deadlines and requirements that the SEC puts on them. Second one, are you a federal contractor yourself? Are you a vendor or supplier for federal contractors? Jed, your question is a really good one. And for the group, for organizations with outsourced CISOs or cyber incident response teams, what do we consider the best practice or process to delineate roles and responsibilities during an incident response? The first piece of that question I would say is, I strongly encourage you to have that conversation ahead of time. That should be, in a sense, and especially if you're on a periodic renewal for those services, next time you are in the spot where you are shopping for that service, I would start asking them to come in and meet with you and explain how they would do it. See what they automatically do already, decide whether that fits with your organizational culture. Also, what services are they going to provide, and what are they expecting you as your organization to provide? Some of the areas where I expect you as the company are going to take on a bigger role will be for communications, both internal to the employees and then external. If there's a call center that needs to be set up, is that something that you as the company are going to be doing, or do you need to arrange that to get an additional vendor that's going to be an external resource that helps you with that? So I treat it a lot like I would for when I'm looking at having companies renew their cyber insurance policies. That's where you have the best leverage to figure out what rules and what services you're going to expect them to provide, get it in writing, and then make sure that it aligns with the company's culture and expectations of how they would handle a response plan. Okay. Yep, about 50-50 for suppliers and vendors for federal contractors. The reason I brought this up is the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council, the FAR Council, just put out proposed rules to update federal regulations that are going to be applicable across all agencies, defense and civilian. So anybody that is providing services and goods to Health and Human Services, to the EPA, whomever, not just the DoD, they're going to have to beef up their cybersecurity programs. They're also going to have to make their information and their networks available for CISA to come in and look at in the event of an incident. So most of the time, these requirements flow downhill, not only to the prime contractor for the agency, but to all of its subs. And I see that certainly with the defense contracts, where the disclosure notification requirements are to rapidly notify, and they define rapid notification as 72 hours, the DoD of a cybersecurity incident. And that requirement is flowed down through every single subcontractor and lower tier sub that's performing that contract. So there are going to be ripple effects where companies, even if you weren't, in a sense, don't think of yourself as a federal contractor, where you're going to want to get to on those topics. Okay, notifications. This is the point in an incident response activity where you make the whole world angry. And why? Because you start giving bad news to your customers, your business partners, to regulators, and there is a significant demand for more information. I'm working a data incident now where the client is responded quickly to the event. They identified it, they've analyzed it, but we recognize that a small fraction of their total data that they possess from multiple customers was exposed and potentially copied by the hacker and landed on a server in Eastern Europe. The FBI was involved from day one, and the FBI was able to track down and obtain the server and now possesses the server, but they're doing the analysis work on it. The downside is it's taking some time for that analysis to take place. And for all of the reasons that we've gone through here in the last 20 minutes, you can see that there is a significant amount of pressure from customers who have their own reporting obligations to ask the victim company, was my stuff taken? And right now, they are unable to answer that question, because if 2% of the universe of data was taken, and of that 2%, we don't know yet whether personal information was in there or not, the choice is, do you send out a whole bunch of false positives, false alarms, and start crying wolf, where everybody then starts to tune out, the problem, or do you wait until you get a better sense of, is it more likely than not than personal information was exposed? So that's going to be the challenge, and one of the things that you face with the notifications. The other piece on there in the middle, it's a little buried in the text, but who decides when an incident will be deemed a data breach? My strong suggestion there is that the legal team for the company should be the ones making that call. And that should be something that you train your IT folks on. That the word, a data breach, is now a legal term of art, and everything until your legal group says that this is a breach should be referred to as an incident or an event or something along that line. If you have an event, and I took this graphic came from InfoSec Works. I loved it. It was on SecureWorks, on a webinar I was on yesterday. And I liked it because it gives you a visual image of what I was going to bore you with for another sort of story on ransomware behaviors. But ransomware has evolved to no longer be a one-stop, criminal act that locks you out of your system. You pay money and you get your data back, or you get your system back. It has become a sophisticated extortion ring. And what takes place here is the intruder gets into your network. They look to hunt around, navigate their way through it, learn as much as they can about it, deploy their malware into your system, and then get ready to leverage that to the maximum extent that they can against you, such that when they deploy it, they've already copied or exfiltrated, what they have thought was either all of your data or valuable data, and then talk to you, see if they can get a payment from you. If you pay them, what you've done is you've told the criminal world now that you're a mark that is willing to pay to get data back. And even if they do that, they might help you to restore your data, but odds are they're going to come back for a second bite at the apple and tell you if you don't pay them again, they found all of your intellectual property when they had scoured your network before they locked you out of it, and they're going to give it to your competitor. And then the third iteration that I've seen happen on it lately has been that they then move to the protection shakedown. And they say, well, your company's famous for paying ransoms. There are several groups in Asia and Eastern Europe that are going to come after you, but for $15,000 a month, $50,000 a month, whatever the case may be, we will protect you from those groups. All you have to do is keep paying us. So the decision on paying a ransom really needs to be thought through and addressed from a scenario standpoint, as well as the first time you're dealing with the interruption in your business activity. Most recent example, just to show how innovative criminals can be, the SEC received a complaint from the hacker about a company that had suffered a data breach a couple of weeks ago, hadn't paid the ransom, and the hackers notified the SEC and said, we got into their system. This is a material event. They should have told you about it. You may want to investigate them. So it's a nefarious way to look at how things can go wrong when you're dealing with criminals, and the idea that trying to keep things under wraps are not likely to happen. So that's really everything here. At the bottom, it's much more of a what's going to happen next approach that you should discuss with your business leaders and boards of directors. And then once you are through the problem, and you're into the recovery phase, it's an aspect of looking at, okay, do we know what caused the problem? How have we remediated it? Can we bring systems back online? And can we do so safely? If you're thinking about the Pennsylvania and the water supply system, that may be a challenge there of, you know, we've got operational technology as opposed to just IT. And are there physical kinetic consequences that can happen if we bring things on that when they aren't safe to operate? Have you talked to all your business partners, met all your contractual requirements when it comes to notifications? And then lastly, what rules and regulations are we looking at dealing with now? I have 3 slides here that look at a lot of content because the world is changing rapidly. And the reason I asked about industry sectors before is it helps you figure out which ones are going to be applicable to you and which ones do you need to know about. But coming out in March of 2024 is when we expect CISA to come out with its Cyber Incident Reporting on Critical Infrastructure Act. There'll be regulations there. The federal acquisition regs rules that I talked about earlier. The FCC has looking at making an IoT cybersecurity label for eligible devices. And then we have the FTC updated its breach disclosure rules for non-banking financial institutions. And we have TSA issuing cybersecurity directives for freight rail operators and directives for oil and gas pipeline operators. With all of that going on, the Office of the National Cyber Director is trying to harmonize regulations for the other industry sectors. And I know I'm out of time, so I apologize to AI and quantum, but there are rules that are coming out there. With quantum, I would just say, remember the moniker, steal it now, crack it later, because that's what is being done with the idea that quantum computers will break the current encryption models. And then here are some of the federal resources that are available to you within the critical infrastructure space. Thanks, Stephanie. That should cover it.
I feel like the Grim Reaper, like when I put my video on, you're like, I gotta wrap up. So just want to it was really great, a really great program, Erik. Just want to be cognizant of everyone's day. Right. Before we kicked off, I forgot to mention this. Erik shared with me his team's goal at Husch Blackwell for the cybersecurity team. And the goal for the group is to be strategic partners and advisors who identify concerns or risks before they disrupt the operation. And I just thought that was a really great goal and kind of a tagline for the group. So thank you so much. Thank you all for joining. We will follow up with you guys individually, whoever submitted a question. Just to wrap things up, this is approved for the continuing legal education credits. So just click on that CEU icon at the bottom of your screen to report your hours. And then a certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow along with a recording. We're going to include a link to that blog that Erik mentioned earlier, the Bite Back blog. It's our privacy blog that's updated regularly. So we'll make it really easy for everybody to subscribe to that. And then please do give us your feedback in the survey. And again, please keep in touch. We'll have programming kicking off next year. We'll have 3 webinars. I already talked to Tommaso about a St. Louis alumni event. And then we might have some in-person events in other markets. So keep in touch and have a great rest of your day and great rest of 2023. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.